They say silence never truly fell at Tyburn. Even in death the air pulsed with noise, the cry of the condemned's family. The hiss of gin bottles passed from hand to hand. The roar of thousands gathered not to mourn, but to watch. And there, at the centre, a man dangled from the gallows. His body swayed gently in the autumn breeze, his legs convulsing in helpless spasms. The rope bit into his throat, not snapping the neck cleanly, but choking him inch by inch in a dance the mob came to call the Tyburn Jig. The sound was unforgettable. The scrape of boots clawing against empty air, the guttural, strangled gasps as lungs begged for one final breath. Some in the crowd cheered, some laughed. Others whispered prayers, too afraid to raise their voices above the din. The child on his father's shoulders leaned forward, eyes wide, watching with the rapt curiosity of one who has never yet seen death and will never forget the shape of it again. The condemned man's face turned red, then purple tongue swelling grotesquely as the minutes dragged on like hours. And the smell. It was a carnival stench, roasted chestnuts smoking in the cold air, the acrid tang of gin spilled carelessly on the ground, sweat from bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. But it mingled with something darker, the sour reek of human terror. The smell of a body dying slowly of fear, so thick it clung to the throat as surely as the rope did to the condemned. When finally the twitching stopped, when the figure stilled at last into silence, the roar of the crowd swelled again like thunder. Some clapped as if it were theatre. Some wept openly. The condemned man's life had ended, but his death was only beginning its second act. For soon, surgeons from anatomy schools would arrive, eager to slice open flesh that was still warm to turn punishment into science, to profit from what remained of his suffering. This was London's theatre of death. Tyburn Gallows, an execution ground that for centuries was not only a site of punishment, but a place of entertainment. Here, justice was performed, not merely carried out. It was a stage, and the actors were condemned, forced to play their parts in front of an audience of thousands. The spectacle was grotesque, yet it drew the city again and again. Why? Why would men, women, even children flock to watch the slow strangulation of another human being? Why did London make death a holiday cruelty, a carnival? And why did so many accept it, not with horror, but with laughter, as though the agony of a dangling body was no more than a passing amusement? Stay with me and you will learn the truth of Tyburn. You will walk with the condemned from the prison cell, to the cart from the cart, to the noose from the noose, to the surgeon's knife. And as you watch, perhaps, you will ask yourself what it means, not only to die this way, but to live in a society that demands it. Before we step into the shadow of the gallows, let us first wander through the London that fed it. For to understand why Tyburn became both theatre and grave, we must see the city as it was dazzling, cruel, intoxicating, a place where fortune glittered in one hand and the hangman's rope coiled in the other. Picture the great city in the 17th and 18th centuries rising from the ashes of plague and fire. St. Paul's Cathedral gleamed against the sky, a beacon of power. Along the Thames, ships returned heavy with sugar, tobacco and silks, wealth pouring into England's beating heart. The nobility feasted in candle-lit halls, draped in velvet and jewels, while merchants crowded taverns with tankards of ale, boasting of fortunes won across seas. But beneath this splendour stretched another London, the labyrinth of alleys, the smoke-thick taverns where gin ran cheaper than bread, the workhouses filled with orphans, the prisons swollen with debtors. A city divided. For every manor house there were 10 hovels. For every feast 1,000 hungry mouths. To survive in this world was a balancing act. One wrong step could plunge you from privilege into the abyss. It was in this abyss that Tyburn found its audience. The rich came to reaffirm their distance from the rope. The poor came to remind themselves they had not yet been chosen. Public executions were equalizers of a kind noblemen could die beside pickpockets, though the truth was rarely so balanced. For petty theft, stealing a loaf of handkerchief, a few coins was often enough to earn a sentence of death. The law called the Bloody Code listed more than 200 crimes punishable by hanging. Yet those of means, those with titles or wealth, were shielded by fines, pardons, or the invisible protection of influence. And so Tyburn stood as both warning and entertainment. It was the city's grim heartbeat 3 miles from Newgate prison, where condemned prisoners travelled in carts as the crowd gathered to jeer or cheer. To some, the gallows represented justice, a promise that order would be maintained in a city teetering between brilliance and chaos. To others it was a holiday, a chance to see friends drink gin, sell pies, and watch another soul dangle. The irony was stark. While courts and judges spoke of law, of morality, of protecting society, the people saw execution as spectacle. Mothers brought children, lovers clutched each other, hawkers cried their wares over the condemned's final prayers. It was a gilded cage, this London shining on the outside, rotten within. A city that promised prosperity, but delivered punishment, that built cathedrals to heaven and gallows to hell. And into this world walked the condemned, sometimes guilty, often desperate, always doomed. They lived in the shadow of the glittering city, knowing full well that the same crowd that bought their bread today might watch their strangulation tomorrow. The path to Tyburn rarely began with grand crimes. More often, it began with whispers. A missing handkerchief in a crowded market, a loaf of bread slipped beneath a coat, a suspicious glance cast by a constable whose eyes never stopped scanning for guilt. In London's narrow alleys and teeming taverns, rumour was as deadly as steel, and once your name was spoken in connection with theft, forgery, or fraud, the gallows' shadow lengthened over you. It might start with betrayal. A so-called friend, hoping to spare themselves, pointed a finger. A rival thief, cornered by the watch, spilled names in exchange for freedom. Or worse, a neighbour who envied your shoes, your laughter, your survival, claimed you had stolen from them. In a city where survival itself often meant bending rules, guilt was less about what you had done than who had chosen to accuse you. There were other cracks in the fortress walls. The law itself, swollen with cruelty, turned trivial acts into capital crimes. Forging a coin, poaching a deer, even cutting down a tree could bring a death sentence. The so-called Bloody Code did not distinguish between murder and mischief. It demanded blood, not balance. The streets whispered with this truth. You could wake one morning free, and by nightfall find your name inked into the register of the condemned. For those who lived at the margins, fear was constant. The constable's lantern at the window in the dead of night, the heavy knock at the door, these were omens that turned courage into ash. The sound of boots in the alley might mean a brawl, or it might mean the beginning of the end. Few knew when their last drink in a tavern would be their last freedom, their final taste of laughter before silence swallowed it whole. And yet, there was always a strange fatalism. Some joked about Tyburn calling the gallows the tree. They sang songs about the Tyburn Jig mocking death, as if laughter could blunt the rope's bite. But underneath the songs, the bravado lay dread. For once, suspicion clung to you. Once rumour hardened into accusation, there was no path back to innocence. The gallows was patient waiting, and sooner or later its noose tightened. This was the seed of doom, not one dramatic moment, but a slow gathering storm. A careless word, a jealous glare, a desperate act born of hunger. No one believed it would be them, not truly, until the day came when shackles closed around their wrists and the road to Tyburn opened beneath their feet. It often began with the sound of fists pounding on wood. A door shattered open in the dead of night, lantern light flooding the room, and before a man could rise from his bed, the iron was already clamped on his wrists. Constables moved quickly, for hesitation was dangerous. Neighbours might intervene, Families might plead. But once the warrant was signed, the law had to be performed with cold efficiency. The shock was always the same. One moment a man was a husband, a father, a neighbour known on the street. The next he was dragged half-dressed into the chill of London's night, his hands bound like an animal. The words of indictment were read in a flat monotone. You stand accused of theft, of fraud, of murder. The crime hardly mattered. For once the accusation was public, it clung tighter than the shackles themselves. From there the condemned was paraded through the very streets they had once walked freely. Some neighbours jeered, relieved to see suspicion deflected from themselves. Others stood silently, pity carved into their faces, knowing they were powerless to intervene. Children stared wide-eyed, clutching their mothers' skirts, as if memorising the spectacle for the day when it might be their turn to watch or be watched. The destination was always the same Newgate prison. The heavy doors creaked open, swallowing the prisoner in darkness. The sound echoed like the closing of a coffin lid, sealing away not only freedom, but hope itself. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot-damp straw and unwashed bodies. Prisoners groaned in the shadows, some awaiting trial, others awaiting death. All shared the same look in their eyes, the knowledge that once you passed through Newgate's gates, the world outside rarely saw you again, except dangling at Tyburn. There were moments when the condemned still clung to illusions. A desperate thought that friends might speak in their defence, that the judge might show mercy, that the gallows might be avoided. But such hope drained quickly. The guards' laughter, the chaplain's perfunctory prayers, the sneers of fellow prisoners, everything whispered the same truth. The trap was sprung and there was no escape. Perhaps the cruelest part was how swiftly it all fell apart. A man who yesterday was drinking ale with friends could today find himself branded as a criminal, locked behind stone walls, his name already whispered in taverns as the next to dance the Tyburn Jig. Security, reputation, dignity, all stripped away in the space of hours. And so he waited, shackled in darkness, the echo of the crowd's jeers still ringing in his ears. Outside life in London continued as always. Markets bustled, ships, unloaded children played. But for the man inside Newgate, the world had narrowed to a single road. A short, inevitable road leading not to freedom, but to the gallows tree. The days inside Newgate stretched like an eternity. Time did not flow there. It rotted stagnant and foul like the straw on the stone floor. The condemned man, once surrounded by the familiar clamour of taverns or the bustle of markets, now knew only the drip of water from cracks in the ceiling, the coughs and moans of fellow prisoners, and the gnawing cold that settled into his bones. Loneliness was the cruelest companion. Though the cells were often crowded, each man was trapped within himself, circling endlessly through thoughts he could not escape. Some prayed whispering half-remembered psalms into the dark, clutching at faith as though it were rope to pull them from the abyss. Others raged, pounding fists against the stone until their knuckles split as if defiance might undo the sentence already written in the court's book. And some surrendered entirely, sinking into silence, their eyes hollow, their minds already halfway to the grave. Betrayal festered in those hours. The friend who had promised to speak in his defence but never came. The family is too poor or too afraid to pay for a lawyer's help. The neighbours who once shared laughter but now whispered about him as though he were already dead. Newgate was not only a prison of stone, but of memory. Every kindness that might have saved him, replayed in his mind, twisted now into abandonment. He could not decide which was worse, that they had failed him, or that perhaps they had never truly cared. And yet, even in despair, human weakness persisted. Guards, corrupt and greedy, sold gin to the condemned. Some drank until they collapsed, drowning the terror in a haze that numbed body and soul. Others clung to scraps of pleasure. A crust of bread smuggled by a sympathetic visitor, a locket kissed in the dark, a fleeting touch of a hand through the bars. Each small comfort was both balm and torment, for it reminded the prisoner of life, even as life slipped further away. But the greatest horror was anticipation. For unlike sudden death on the street or in battle here, the condemned knew exactly what awaited. They had heard the stories. They had seen men led away in carts, their faces pale, but proud only to return as corpses to be dissected by eager surgeons. They knew of the rope of the long minutes of strangulation, of the crowd's jeers. Night after night, sleep offered no relief for dreams twisted into visions of the gallows. A hand reaching up to tug at an invisible noose, a throat tightening until breath vanished. These became nightly rehearsals for the final performance. In Newgate, death was not sudden. It was a slow drip, a steady drumbeat, a suffocating weight, pressing down until the prisoner's soul bent under it. By the time dawn broke on the day of judgment, many were already ghosts in their own bodies. The courtroom of the Old Bailey was meant to look imposing. Its wood polished its benches, crowded its judges, robed in scarlet, trimmed with ermine. But beneath the ceremony, the proceedings were little more than theatre, and everyone knew how the play would end. The condemned was dragged in chains before the bench, gaunt from the filth of Newgate, his voice hoarse from days of damp silence. Around him, murmurs rippled through the public gallery. Ordinary Londoners had come not to see fairness, but to see drama, another prelude to the gallows spectacle. The trial began with a flourish of words, but truth was rarely its concern. Prosecutors thundered their voices, heavy with righteous indignation, pointing to scraps of evidence, to questionable testimony, to whispers dressed up as fact. Witnesses shuffled forward some petty thieves themselves, testifying in exchange for coin or leniency. Others were neighbours who had quarrelled with the accused, their bitterness now polished into oaths sworn before God and judge. Few dared to lie outright, but fewer still hesitated to exaggerate, to tilt the scales. The accused might plead, might protest, might even summon a friend to speak on his behalf. But who listened? A poor man could not afford barristers trained in clever rhetoric, while the wealthy seldom stood here at all. The judge aloof guided the jury with subtle nods, his questions sharp, where they might wound, indulgent, where they might shield the Crown's case. Trials that might decide a man's life lasted an hour, sometimes less. And though the law claimed impartiality, it was a mask so thin that even the condemned could see through it. When the verdict came, it came swiftly. Guilty. The word clanged like iron, like the slamming of a cell door. Then came the ritual of sentencing, performed with all the solemnity of a church service, the judge's voice rising as he declared that the prisoner would be taken from this place, conveyed to Newgate, and from thence to Tyburn, where he would be hanged by the neck until he be dead. The words were always the same, rehearsed across centuries, stripped of mercy. The prisoner stood in silence, or sometimes cried out, or sometimes laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it all. But no reaction mattered. Once pronounced, the sentence was carved into fate itself. The jurors shuffled out, the crowd dispersed, and the judge removed his wig, ready for the next performance. Justice had been served, or so they claimed. But it was not justice. It was a ritual sacrifice cloaked in law. For in that room, fairness was never the aim. The condemned was not measured against truth, but against the city's hunger for order and its appetite for spectacle. The trial was a stage, the judge its priest, and the sentence its offering. The gallows waited as it always did. The night before Tyburn was unlike any other. For most condemned men, it was the longest night of their lives, yet also the shortest. The hours bled away, as though time itself wished to hurry them to the rope. In Newgate's cells, some lay awake, staring at the damp ceiling, tracing cracks in the stone as though they might reveal an escape. Others prayed with the prison chaplain, his voice calm, his words well worn from repetition. Still others sought solace in drink for the guards' corrupt, but practical, sold gin to the dying at a price. A few swallowed so much that they were carried to the gallows half senseless, their courage numbed. Then came the rituals. The condemned might be allowed to write a letter, scratching final words with trembling hands. Some addressed them to wives, to mothers, to children who would never see them return. These letters were rarely delivered. Too often they vanished into the pockets of officials. Still the act of writing, of trying to reach across the gulf of death, mattered. Others gave away small possessions, a ring, a locket, even a scrap of cloth, tokens of a life soon to end. There was food too, what was called the last meal. In truth, it was usually plain bread broth, or a cut of meat, if charity allowed. Few could eat much, for the stomach knotted itself against hunger, twisting with dread. Yet some forced themselves, as if to prove they were still alive, still human even in their final hours. The chaplain visited, urging confession, reminding the condemned that repentance might save their souls, if not their bodies. Some wept and begged forgiveness. Others cursed God for his silence. And some refused to speak at all their silence, a last rebellion against a world that had already taken everything else. As dawn crept across the city, the sounds of London waking filtered into the prison. The rumble of carts, the cries of hawkers, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. For the condemned, each sound was sharpened, magnified, as though the world itself was mocking them with its normalcy. Then the moment arrived. The doors of the cell groaned open, and the condemned was led into the pale light of morning. Outside the Tyburn cart waited a rough wooden wagon, its boards scarred by countless prisoners who had ridden it before. The ropes were ready. The crowd was already gathering along the road. In those last moments, humanity shone through in strange ways. A man might press a kiss to a lock of hair sent by his lover. Another might whisper a final joke to his fellow prisoner, laughter rasping through fear. Some prayed aloud, clinging to faith as the only anchor left. Each detail, however small, became sacred, burned into the memory of all who watched. This was the final sunrise, the last stretch of road before the noose. The cart creaked forward, hooves striking against the stones, and London poured into the streets to see the condemned on their final journey. It was not a solemn procession, but a carnival. Vendors cried out their wares, pies, gingerbread, and jugs of gin, as if this were a fairground. Men and women pushed against each other for a glimpse, shouting insults, mocking, or in rare moments offering blessings. Mothers hoisted children high on their shoulders, eager for them to witness what they called justice. For the crowd, this was holiday. For the condemned, it was a march into a nightmare. The 3-mile journey from Newgate to Tyburn was slow, deliberate. The cart rattled through Holborn and St. Giles, past taverns whose patrons stumbled out with tankards raised in mocking salute. Sometimes friends of the condemned walked beside the cart, grasping at hands, weeping, singing psalms through tears. Others hurled rotten fruit, spitting curses, determined to savour cruelty. And all the while the condemned swayed in chains exposed to every eye. At last the gallows tree appeared, great wooden beams rising stark against the sky. Not one rope, but several for Tyburn was built to hang many at once. Some days saw 3, 6, even a dozen men dancing together in the air. The crowd pressed close, thousands upon thousands, the roar of their voices like a sea. The condemned were helped or dragged up onto the platform. The executioner adjusted the ropes, tightening the coarse hemp around throats that quivered and swallowed against the inevitable. Some prisoners prayed aloud, voices trembling, as they begged God for mercy. Others cursed the judge, the crowd, even the king himself spitting defiance until the hood muffled their words. Still others tried to appear brave, offering jokes to their executioner as if gallows humour could soften death's approach. And then, the moment. The cart beneath them lurched forward, wheels groaning as it rolled away. The condemned dropped not far, not enough to break the neck clean. Instead, the noose tightened with a savage grip, crushing windpipe strangling breath. Their bodies jerked violently, heels kicking against empty air hands, clawing at nothing. This was the Tyburn Jig, not an instant end, but a long, terrible dance with death. The faces told the story. Lips swelled and darkened eyes bulged with blood, tongues pushed grotesquely past clenched teeth. Some struggled for minutes, their chests heaving, gasping in sounds that were more animal than human. The crowd watched spellbound. Some laughed, cheering each desperate twitch. Others grew pale, crossing themselves, shaken by the cruelty they had come to celebrate. When at last the bodies stilled, the silence was worse than the screams. There they hung swaying gently in the wind like broken marionettes suspended by invisible strings. Justice had been performed. But what kind of justice leaves a man writhing like that before thousands of jeering eyes? When the condemned finally stilled, a hush rippled across the sea of faces. For a moment the crowd seemed uncertain. Should they cheer? Should they pray? Should they simply stare? The silence was heavy, eerie, made all the more jarring by the chaos that had preceded it. The only sound was the creak of rope and the faint rustle of clothes as the bodies swayed in the breeze, lifeless marionettes suspended above the earth. Then the noise returned. Some in the throng erupted into cheers, toasting the death with tankards raised high. Others pushed forward, eager to touch the foot of the hanged, believing it might bring luck or cure disease. There were women who dipped handkerchiefs in the sweat of the dying, convinced it held mystical properties. Children pointed with wide eyes, their mothers whispering, "Remember, this justice is swift for those who stray." But behind the crowd's morbid fascination lurked a colder truth. The fate of the body was rarely burial. The surgeons were waiting. At the edge of the crowd, apprentices from anatomy schools lingered, their eyes fixed on the corpses. When the sheriff's men declared the execution complete, the bodies were cut down and thrown onto carts sometimes before the last trace of warmth had left them. No prayers were spoken, no rites performed. Flesh was no longer human, it was material. At the dissection halls, students jostled for a chance to watch as knives opened skin, as muscles were peeled back, as organs were displayed like curiosities. The execution had fed the crowd's hunger for spectacle. Now the cadaver fed science's appetite for knowledge. It was said that a body could be worth more dead than alive, more useful as a lesson in anatomy than as a warning on the gallows. The condemned had not only lost life, but dignity denied, even the peace of the grave. The ground at Tyburn itself bore its own silent testimony. For centuries it had drunk the blood and sweat of countless men and women. Some were buried hastily in shallow pits nearby, unmarked and unremembered. Others were left to hang until the elements took them. Their remains carried off by crows or scattered by the wind. The soil was thick with the remnants of those who had danced the Tyburn Jig, though no monument ever rose to mark their passing. And so, after the jeering subsided, after the vendors packed their carts, and the crowd drifted back to taverns and homes, the field grew quiet again. The gallows loomed empty, its ropes swaying gently as though waiting. The silence that followed each execution was not peaceful. It was hollow, unsettling, a reminder that justice here was not about the individual who had died, but about the ritual itself. Tyburn demanded victims, and the city was always ready to provide them. Centuries have passed since the gallows at Tyburn last creaked under the weight of the condemned, yet its shadow lingers. Where once ropes swung and crowds roared today, there are only streets, houses, and the hum of modern London life. The Marble Arch stands nearby, a silent sentinel, while beneath the earth lies soil that once drank deeply of blood and fear. The gallows are gone, but the memory remains a scar on the city's conscience, faint but never healed. Tyburn was more than a place of execution. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting its hunger, its cruelty, its contradictions. The law claimed to protect the people, yet it slaughtered them by the dozens for crimes as small as theft. The church spoke of mercy, yet chaplains preached salvation while men strangled in agony before their eyes. And the people, ordinary Londoners, treated it as a festival, cheering, jeering, buying pies, drinking gin, as though another human's death were no more than an afternoon's amusement. There is irony here, sharp as the blade of a surgeon's scalpel. For while the condemned were meant to be warnings examples of crime punished, their suffering became entertainment. The gallows became a theatre, and the actors had no choice but to play their roles. The crowd claimed they came to learn morality, to remind themselves of the wages of sin. But what they truly learned was something darker, that death when made public can become spectacle, and that cruelty when dressed in the robes of law can be mistaken for justice. And what of those bodies carried from rope to dissecting table? They too tell a story. Science advanced surgeons learned, students studied, but at what cost? Human dignity was stripped away, reduced to organs and tissue displayed in lantern-lit halls. Even in death, the condemned were not free. Their bodies served another purpose, their suffering extended beyond the grave. What echoes from Tyburn is not only the cries of the dying, but the questions their deaths left behind. What does it mean for a society to gather by the thousands to watch another human struggle for air? What does it say about us when justice becomes entertainment, when punishment becomes ritual, when death becomes carnival? The gallows are gone, but the hunger that built them is not. Even now, we flock to stories of crime, to images of violence, to the spectacle of downfall. Perhaps we are not so different from the crowds that once cheered the Tyburn Jig. Perhaps the rope has merely changed form, hidden behind screens and headlines, yet still demanding that we watch. So the question remains haunting and unshakable when we revel in the suffering of others, when we turn justice into spectacle. Are we truly condemning the guilty, or are we only revealing ourselves?